Oedipa wondered whether, at the end of this, if it were supposed to end, she too might not be left with only compiled memories of clues, announcements, intimations, but never the central truth itself, which must somehow each time be too bright for her memory to hold, which must always blaze out, destroying its own message irreversibly, leaving an overexposed blank when the ordinary world came back. In the space of a sip of dandelion wine, it came to her that she would never know how many times such a seizure may already have visited, or how to grasp it should it visit again. I got inspired to, for some reason, make a video about Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. In this video, I think I'm going to try to just lay out my thoughts on this book, and it's more so going to be a way for me to think through what I just read. If you want a consolidated review of this book, I would recommend you download Goodreads. Just search up The Crying of Lot 49 in Goodreads, and then I think it's like the second most popular comments by a gentleman, Ian. He does a great job of actually like dissecting the book, and it's going to be a better place for you to get a summary of this book than likely what I am going to say here in the next couple of minutes. But regardless, I just wanted to speak about it a little bit and practice kind of getting my thoughts out. And I wanted to mainly create something. So that's kind of the purpose of this. Okay, so some background on Thomas Pynchon. We don't know much about him. He is notorious for avoiding interviews and the press, which I respect. We do know that he went to Cornell briefly for 2 years, and he was in the engineering physics program there. He left Cornell and joined the Navy for 2 years. He had a brief stint in the Navy. After leaving the Navy, he returned to Cornell, and he this time was pursuing a degree in English. He graduated from Cornell with a degree in English, found himself in Seattle at Boeing. I believe this was from, I have notes here. I'm gonna move this out of the way and check my notes. I think it was from 60 to 62. Is this right? Yes, so he worked at Boeing from 60 to 62. After that, he published his first novel, V, and shortly after publishing V in 66, he published this guy right here, The Crying of Lot 49. So very foundationally, the story here is, I would dare maybe say simple. It's about Oedipa Maas. She, in the first page, is named executor of Pierce in Variety's will. She hasn't spoken to Pierce in, I believe, over a year, and Oedipa's and Pierce's relationship is left pretty ambiguous. There's not much description going on. I assumed the whole time that it was an ex-boyfriend of hers. Regardless, though, this Pierce gentleman, who has named Oedipa as executor of his will, is a super rich LA businessman. He's kind of this mysterious, odd figure. And basically, the novel just details Oedipa's quest of distributing his assets, we'll say. And along the way, she discovers, essentially, in my mind, like a secret or a clandestine Illuminati-esque postal service group. The name of the postal service group is called Tristero, and this group has a whole bunch of very odd connections to Pierce. So the majority of the novel just details and describes Oedipa encountering all sorts of these weird like signs and symbols and conspiracies that are connected, that make connections to Pierce and this secret postal service organization. The end of the novel kind of leaves off with Oedipa waiting for a buyer for the lot of 49. It's mentioned that Pierce has this stamp collection that again has heavy ties to this Tristero group, and this stamp collection is being auctioned off, and the stamp collection has been labeled or assigned Lot 49. And Oedipus, near the end of the novel, gets information that there's a buyer interested in purchasing the stamp collection, and she is awaiting the crying of Lot 49, hence the title of the novel. Of course, Thomas Pynchon doesn't ever tell us if this person showed up. There's no mention of any sort of like conclusion. Oedipus never meets the man. She's just sitting there awaiting the crying of Lot 49. Okay, so my experience reading The Crying of Lot 49. This was my first Pynchon novel that I ever read. I tried to pick up Gravity's Rainbow a long time ago, and I gave up after like 70 pages. This was maybe a year ago. I took some time off, some other readings. I read some Dickens. I read some David Foster Wallace, just some light stuff. I finished a couple other books and decided to give Pynchon another shot. So we came back to The Crying of Lot 49. This was 152 pages, so I felt like it was a lot less of a commitment for me to make, and it was going to be easier for me to read, which it was. I did read this book twice, though. The first time through, I will admit I understood very little. It was pretty confusing, and I felt like halfway through my first read, I just knew that I was going to have to read it again. And I was like, all right, we're just going to read it the first time and get a little bit of the lay of the land and revisit it later, which I did almost immediately. I finished the book, and I basically just flipped back to page 1 and gave it another read through. And the second time, things started to make a little more sense. I still probably don't have, I don't have a great understanding of this book, but I wanted to speak a little bit about my experiences with reading this and some things that stuck out to me. I guess the first thing that stuck out to me, and this was on my first read, was like this idea or this question of whether I can read a book, not understand said book, and still get enjoyment of the book. And the answer to that is yes. Which is ironic and funny because I immediately then, like I said, went back and reread it to understand it. But that's an interesting idea because I think some of the idea and the themes in this book that Thomas Pynchon is trying to convey is the idea that you can't know everything. There's so much information in this book. There's so many enigmatic like signs and symbols and events and conversations and characters in this book, and Oedipus just becomes so confused and caught up in this rabbit hole, and things aren't making sense, and she's kind of progressing forward in her journey regardless. And so I think that's maybe one of the things that Pynchon's trying to convey in here is like the impossibility of fully and completely understanding things, and he's trying to also potentially communicate that like that's okay. And I contrast that to David Foster Wallace a little bit, who I feel like needed and wanted to know everything and would overthink things, and that's an impossible task to set for yourself. This is a quote from page 10. As things developed, she was to have all manner of revelations, hardly about Pierce in variety or herself, but about what remained yet had somehow, before this, stayed away. There had hung the sense of buffering, insulation. She had noticed the absence of an intensity, as if watching a movie, just perceptibly out of focus, that the projectionist refused to fix. And had also gently conned herself into the curious, Rapunzel-like role of a pensive girl, somehow, magically, prisoner among the pines and salt fogs of Knert, looking for somebody to say, hey, let down your hair. Something else that I picked up while reading this novel was kind of the sense that Oedipus doesn't trust in her perspective or in her reality. There's multiple mentions throughout the novel of her wanting to be sick or wanting somebody to confirm that she's hallucinating or is having a fantasy. One of my favorite quotes from the book, this is on page 113, kind of gets at this idea as well. I came, she said, hoping you could talk me out of a fantasy. Cherish it, cried Hilarious fiercely. What else do any of you have? Hold it tightly by its little tentacle. Don't let the Freudians coax it away or the pharmacists poison it out of you. Whatever it is, hold it dear, For when you lose it, you go over by that much to the others. You begin to cease to be. So I like that for a couple of reasons, because this hilarious figure is Oedipa's shrink, and he's maybe not mentally all there himself. But when I was reading that, I figured that she was seeking his counsel, this expert's counsel, to like confirm her perspective or her reality for her. And you can't expect other people to do that for you. I think that's maybe something else that I picked up in this book as well. And not just for that reason either. Most of the characters that Oedipa comes into contact with in this novel are either die, go insane, or are just in some way removed from her. And again, I think that's just kind of like reinforcing the idea that this I'll say self-development. I don't love that term. The self-development or the self-discovery journey is something that you have to take and invest in as an individual. You can't expect other people to confirm your perspective. Something else this novel made me think about was, at what point does correlation equal causation? It kind of made me think of Carl Jung and his idea of synchronicities, which I wrote down right here. I kind of cheated. Synchronicity, as defined by Jung, is the occurrence of events that are seemingly related but not causally connected, yet hold significant meaning for the observer. So, like I said, Oedipa throughout this novel encounters a plethora of these seemingly unconnected events, but that they hold some sort of value or weight to her. And I was just kind of started to think about like when and at what point should you start paying attention to these synchronicities? When do they mean something? The last question that I wanted to think through was the idea of us being trapped by our subconscious. And this was mainly like a theme and an idea that I got from chapter 1. What did she so desire escape from? Such a captive maiden, having plenty of time to think, soon realizes that her tower, its height and architecture, are like her ego, only incidental, that what really keeps her where she is magic, anonymous and malignant, visited on her from outside and for no reason at all. If the tower is everywhere and the night of deliverance no proof against its magic, what else? I thought that was an interesting idea, because Pynchon's describing this invisible, malignant magic. And I'm not sure in my head if that magic is invisible in the sense of being unidentifiable, but rather that like magic is invisible in a sense of just being, I guess, potentially like untouchable. And I'm thinking that invisible magic is kind of our subconscious. And I'm referencing Dostoevsky when I'm talking about this a little bit, because almost 100 years before Pynchon wrote this book, Dostoevsky wrote Demons, where he essentially laid out that these demons are bad ideas. And then you have Jung 50 years later saying that ideas have people and people don't actually have ideas. And that all just kind of like consolidated and came to a point for me when I read that quote from Pynchon, because I think that this invisible magic isn't so much invisible as it's just our like subconscious patterns of thinking and ideas that are keeping us trapped. And specifically, it's bad ideas and bad patterns of ideas that are keeping us trapped. And I read Neville Goddard a little while ago, not even a little while ago, years ago, but it stuck with me because I think it's so powerful. And he kind of laid out like a system almost for how we can change these bad ideas. And you have to be intentional and conscious about it, and you have to write about it and pray about it and think about it, and you essentially consciously imprint on your subconscious better ideas. So I think that quote just kind of posed the question to me, like, are we all trapped by our subconscious, and how much of our subconscious can we change, and can we come to understand? Yeah, that's my review, I guess, if you want to call this a review. I don't really know what this was. It was more so an opportunity for me to just create something, because I normally just deconstruct and read and consume information and have no output. So I wanted to experiment and put something out in the world. So